ya veo el email que está abajo de Macronde. ¿Entra como panelista o entra como
Todos listos. Cuando llegue a ceros, voy a dar la bienvenida y paso la palabra a los colegas. Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días. Yo soy Hugo
Hello,
Villa.
everyone. I'm Hugo Villa, Director General of the Filmoteca of UNAM. Please be welcome to our third session of our International Symposium on Film Archives with the topic Preventing and Managing Natural and Human-Made Disasters in Film Archives. So, without further ado, I will quickly want to say that I'm very glad to have you all here. And in the lower part in your Zoom screen, you have a little globe with the possibility to hear interpretation to English, Spanish, or French, as these are the official languages of the FIAF. You can send an email to us if you have any questions. These sessions will also be broadcast in YouTube and in the original version and in the interpreted versions so that you can refer to them later. And now I would quickly want to give you an overview. The first presentation will be from Solange Tech from the State University of Paraná, Marilia Franco from the State University of Sao Paulo, and Joao Vieira from the Rio de Janeiro Fluminense Federal University. And it'll speak about that preservation begins in production. Solange, Marilia, Joao, thank you very much.
Gostaria de agradecer muitíssimo a oportunidade de estar nesse simpósio de FIAF 2020, se realiza aí en la Filmoteca de la UNAM. Bueno, yo soy Solange Stex, profesora e investigadora de cine, hago parte del Comité Nacional de Brasil en el programa Memoria del Mundo de la UNESCO, donde represento los archivos audiovisuales. Trabajo en la Universidad Estadual del Paraná, donde coordino el programa de posgrado en artes. João Luiz Vieira, que está acá na mesa, é professor titular do Departamento de Cine e Audiovisual da Universidade Federal Fluminense, em Rio de Janeiro. É investigador, conferencista, autor de diversos livros sobre cine brasileiro que se publicaram no Brasil e no exterior. Ele foi diretor da Cinematheque do Museu de Arte Moderna em Rio e, nesta época, participou de muitos encontros de investigação de cine, incluso los de la FIAF em Paris em 88, em Lisboa em 89. Marília Franco é graduada em cine, maestra e doutora em artes por la Universidade de São Paulo, é professora investigadora de audiovisual e educação e é uma militante da educação de los realizadores para a preservação audiovisual. Nos parece muito importante que se discuta a necessidade de conscientizar os produtores e os diretores de sua responsabilidade na preservação dos meios audiovisuais. A preservação empieza na produção, que é o nome desta mesa, é uma consigna do Centro de Pesquisa de Investigadores desde há muitos anos. E hoje lo hemos traído a este simpósio não só mirando a história do cine brasileiro e latino-americano, sino o futuro da produção em digital. Quero aproveitar este momento, recordar e fazer uma homenagem a Carlos Brandão, que foi diretor do centro, que faleceu em
Recognize Carlos Brandão, who passed away. Carlos was a researcher and a tireless fighter for the preservation of cinema, and we dedicate our talk this morning to him. In Brazil today, we have 12 organizations that work on the conservation. The Center of Research on Brazilian Cinema began its work in 1970 and was started by Paulo Emilio Sales Globes, one of the founders of the Brazilian film collection in Sao Paulo, by Alex Vianney, author of the first book.
Estás haciendo mucho ruido. University of Rio de Janeiro, that was
Who
part
was a leader in
of
film preservation in Latin America. And this contributed to the research and investigation in universities since its founding. He specialized in film production and preservation. This involved the preservation of 7 feature films in 1986. These restoration works were all coordinated by Carlos Emilio Randão, the president of the center, and are very important for the preservation of films. In 1998,
and there was basic
there was an important need for a policy on film preservation.
so
In the
during the
Ouro Preto festival that has worked for
the
15 years on the
Ouro
area
Preto
of film preservation,
festival
a
was being
plan was
carried out
developed,
for 15
and
years.
there's a
So now the
recognition that
government
governments
is
have
inaugurated,
disregarded, and it continues to be an important battle that we must work on. On state policies, more than depending on whatever government is in place. Some of the goals that are necessary for the organization were not even considered by government officials. For example, a national to have interconnected or to work on access and management and risk management. And this has taken a long time. We work very slowly, but we continue to work today on the preservation of cultural heritage in general. An example of this is the case of the Brazilian Cinematheca of Sao Paulo for Latin America, and I think for all the world.
So this is linked to the Ministry of Tourism right now. And the government tries to change all the culture section, and the filmmaking is suffering with that, and preservation is suffering from that as well. And now we are changing this for the to the audiovisual section, which is managing budget for filmmaking. So this is where money for production is, and the president wants the budget for films be decided by the people from the government, and that they also decide what can be produced or not. And that would be going back to censorship. And that is even forbidden in our constitution. But none of that matters to the government that we have today. In 2019, by way of example, there was a suspension of LGBT content, and the the special minister for culture had to leave. He said that he could not support that, and he was an ally of the government. In this year, the representative wanted to forbid a bill of law that was to support the budgets for filmmaking. And today we have somebody who is supporting the government in the special secretary for culture, and he has no experience whatsoever in culture or in filmmaking. And we have now an actress from Red Global in the position, and she was almost appointed to the film archives of Sao Paulo, and she wanted that, but it was not done, fortunately. Some 2 weeks ago, and there was a person who has no experience in audiovisual industry at all as the director of the audiovisual archives of Rio de Janeiro, and which is another space for film preservation in the country. And this it was for several years managed by one of the most important persons in Brazilian film making, and he was in charge of training and production, and now it is also in jeopardy as the whole chain of production. And I am speaking very, very quickly about this, but for us, this is a huge humanitarian disaster, and we will be talking and hearing more about this from the other members of the panel. I would like to give the floor to João Luis Vieira so that he can speak about this and more. And now I'm going to give him the floor.
Yes, I'm here. Yo voy a hablar en inglés porque mi español es un portuñol clásico. No hablo muy bien, comprendo todo, pero me siento assim mais à vontade in English. So I'll be speaking in English now. I'd like, first of all, to thank Hugo Villa. These are my acknowledgements for accepting our suggestion, which was brought by the Center of Research in Brazilian Cinema, as Solange mentioned, during a visit to UNAM in August of last year, 1919. It was an occasion when I was together with Hugo and the chief of the cataloging department at UNAM, Angel Martinez Juarez, whom I also would like to thank here. Well, the Center for Research in Brazilian Cinema has been a member supporter of FIAF since September 2014. And the idea when we discussed last year with Hugo and Angel in that occasion was to extend the scope of natural disasters. And I was reading here the program of FIAF, and there are mentions to earthquakes, tsunamis, and fires and floods, which have also affected Brazilian cinema. Sorry. But we wanted to include human disasters as well, taking into consideration the cultural and political scenario already being experienced in Brazil during the first 6 months of President Jair Bolsonaro's government. The case of Cinematheca Brasileira, the detailed case, will be touched by Fabiana Ferreira in another moment here. But I would like, in my presentation here, although very quickly, go to a brief flashback in September 2018, a day after the fire that destroyed the National Museum of Brazil, Museu Histórico Nacional in Rio, a 200-year-old building that housed generations of research and more than 20 million artifacts in its collection. When Bolsonaro, then still a candidate for the presidency of the country, declared his intention to extinguish the Ministry of Culture and shrink it to a mere secretariat, at the same time that he defended his plans to revise the Rouanet law, a legal mechanism that had been providing funding and tax incentives for the arts and cultural projects. On his second day in office, January 2019, last year, Bolsonaro dismantled the Ministry of Culture, coherent with his campaign promises and continuing his hostile attitude against contemporary artists with special emphasis on film. Moving back to 3 months ago, this year, as soon as the lockdown permitted, a series of protests were performed outside Cinemateca Brasileira, which, as all of us know here, is one of the great archives of the world. These protests were made to denounce the government's bankrupting and closing of this essential cultural resource and its fantastic headquarters in São Paulo. By the time those protests began, its staff had been unpaid for months, actually since January. Then dismissed all 62 of them. Its systems were in danger of complete collapse, its governance in dispute, archives, and its future threatened. While the Cinematheque was already in a bad situation from underfunding and interference, Jair Bolsonaro's election was only increasing attacks to the Cinemateca, to Ancine, Agência Nacional de Cinema, which is the Brazilian film agency, the federal film funding body founded in 2001, and to Brazilian film in general. Even in the midst of the pandemic, Bolsonaro moved aggressively against Brazilian film, in particular, with increasing attacks and dismantlings, with a clear intention of erasing memory. Any other country would be honored and proud of all the films and prizes that Brazilian cinema was being awarded, especially in 2019, last year, when, for example, we had 19 films being screened at different sections of the Berlinale, with two of those 19 films in the main competition, which is not a regular feature. But no, instead, the success of Brazilian cinema seemed to make him hate Brazilian cinema all the more. To erase memory. Another brief mention here, erasing memory. At a governmental meeting on April 22nd this year, the Minister of the Environment, Ricardo Salles, said that with attention focused on the coronavirus, it was time to push through projects that included those paralyzed by the IFAM. IFAM is the Brazilian Institute for the Preservation of the National Artistic and Historic Patrimony, the most important Brazilian preservation agency. What Salles suggested was to force legal ways to flexibilize protection laws, either in terms of patrimony or natural resources, such as the Amazon forest, in order to give away areas valued for their immense natural resources or historical and architectural cultural heritage to construction companies, give them away to construction companies, industries, or hotel chains, for example. We all know, I think everyone knows here that's attending, listening to this, what's happening to the Amazon forest and other natural forests in Brazil. Here lies our human disaster. How to face, how to respond, how to confront, and even negotiate these enormous challenges. Our Constitution states that is the duty of the state, talk about the nation, the Brazilian state, not of the government, not of the occasional governments. It's the duty to protect the country's cultural assets, which includes its filmic heritage. So how can we construct stable institutions that can be able to surpass political governmental changes? Just to finish here with these key questions, I'll leave them open. We don't have answers. We're trying to bring answers to this, to discuss answers. But I take as a good example the Cinemateca Portuguesa, which shares dates and names with our Cinemateca Brasileira. They were both created in 1948, and both also share the enthusiasm and the creative force of none other than Paulo Emílio Salles Gomes, already mentioned here by Solange. Quoting here our colleague from Cinemateca Portuguesa, Tiago Batista, in a recent lecture at the 15th Cine OP, Festival de Cinema de Ouro Preto, which was also mentioned by Solange a few minutes ago. It's the first Brazilian film festival devoted to film preservation and education. Cinemateca Brasileira was created during the Salazar dictatorship, and with a strong emphasis on taking care of the political propaganda machine of Salazar's dictatorship. However, throughout decades, it has been subjected to processes of critical reappropriation and has maintained a political autonomy, sometimes stronger, much stronger even, than important Portuguese national museums. That's a lesson that perhaps we have to create a dialogue with. So how, again, just to finish here, how to confront this other type of disaster, which is not natural? Of course, we have to look for localized responses, very particular, which depends on different historical, national, political, cultural, economic, different contexts. Possible local solutions, maybe. We are looking for local solutions at the moment. We are desperately trying to find answers to those big questions that human disasters bring to us. Thanks, and I'll be here to answer and to dialogue with you. So I'm going to give the room now, the floor, to my colleague Marília Franco from University of São Paulo, Brazil. Marília.
Buenos días a toda la gente, ¿me escuchan?
Good morning. Good morning to everyone. Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me? Perfectly, Marília. Very well. What disasters could I raise after so many questions that have been already mentioned? I'd like to look a little bit in the case of audiovisual production in Brazil, particularly, and in Latin America, more generally, and to propose ideas as to what we can do in the future to change. I'm a graduate of the very first class of cinema created 30 years ago or more by Paolo Emílio Salles Gomes, who was my professor, one of the creators of the Brazilian Film Library, and Professor Andrade, who was also my professor and the founder, the creator of the Film Library. Since that time, we have had a very important course on cinema in one of the most important universities of Latin America, where no one talks about film conservation, and and students are not taught how they can be the first film conservators and how a filmmaker can be the first one to have a role in this. This is the case in which Latin America production is, in general, not housed at companies, but at very small production companies, and that really work only on the production of that filmmaker. And these companies are started to make a given film, and then that company is closed. So we call this independent production, the independent production model. And what conditions does it work under? Brazilian filmmakers who are not trained necessarily in understanding film preservation and do not have any specific inclination necessarily to archive their material or preserve film material creates a paradox that doesn't really have a short-term solution. In the long term, yes, there should be coursework, classes within cinema programs, film programs that would begin to create what I call a culture of film preservation amongst filmmakers, who needs to understand that he or she is the first custodian of that. I have hundreds of examples of people who don't do anything about this, and they come to our research center, the center that Solange and Jean-Louis and I and Carlos Brandão are part of, to ask us to help them in preserving their work. And I always ask, do you know where your negatives are, where your positives are? And they say, I have no idea. What do I do with a person like that who wants to be able to preserve some of their work, but they haven't done anything from the beginning of their career? So this is the first issue. So we have to begin to work with the idea that keeping a piece of paper in a file with information about the cinematographer, for example, is a key. I've had examples of cinematographers who've said to me, when we worked on the preservation of a given film, a very important film in Brazilian history, directed by Pedro de Andrade, who was a filmmaker who had all of his information organized. The cinematographer told me 2 years ago in Brasilia at a meeting in the Center of Researchers on Brazilian Cinema, who told me when we worked on the restoration of that film, I looked for the information that Joaquim Pedro de Andrade had as to how I could preserve the work of the cinematographer. So we have to create a chain of knowledge and of preservation culture, film preservation culture amongst filmmakers in Latin America, so that we can make them the first responsible ones for film preservation, so that when they come to a film library or professionally trained experts in film preservation, it's possible to do this more quickly, with more quality, and with lower budgets. That's my proposal. In a word, we need to think in Latin America, what is the chain of preservation that has to begin with the filmmaker, with the production of the film, and include filmmakers in that chain of care, of custody, to not leave it all in the hands of a center for film preservation or in a film library. That's the comment that I wanted to share with you. Thank you. Thank you. I think this was a very relevant presentation to review how much the state and central governments have to do in this with tax credits that would benefit preservation as well as film creation, and how the ecosystem of our countries will affect countries like Brazil, like Mexico, countries that don't necessarily work as well as they could to effectively preserve their own film heritage. Our second session of today will be by Civil Hayen, and they'll talk to us about the sound library held in the central government's Secretariat of Culture Collections in Mexico. Jose Maria Serral is a historian and composer, historian of music, particularly in the music of cinema, and he has worked practically since he was a student in this discipline at the National University. Jose Maria, you have the floor. Thank you. And remember that I will give you a signal as your time is running out. Thank you also, Solange, Marilia, and Joao. And we'll be back with you at the questions and answers. Thank you. As you were saying, Hugo, I think this is an opportunity, a good opportunity to address very pertinent issues. There is a connection, a clear connection today with practices of preservation of collections from the time of production. So it was wonderful. The collection is an example of the disaster, and this is an example of the disaster of the preservation of memory and of the past, and the disregard or negligence. It might sound critical when really this is not only an issue of governmental authorities. Raúl is one of the most prolific composers, and he did his work at the Churubusco Studios, this large cooperative that we'll talk about, that had a vault with recordings, and he called his specialist a sound expert. Sibyl, thank you. Thank you to all of you. I'm very sympathetic to the stories we've heard from Brazil. So, as Chema has said, I went to the studios with Paulina, and we found a vault with thousands of sound recordings in the sound studios, and it was full of canisters. Some had been perforated, and this was very disturbing for us. And we found a box of a film from Macario and Señora Morales, and here is the recording of the Caudillo, and also from the Papeles Vampiro. These are very important collections. Any person would know that magnetic recordings that were made at the Churubusco Studios might contain part of an important part of the country's history of the thousands of films that were made at those studios. And that possibly these might have been made with the only equipment in the history of the cities of the in the RCA recording machines. That vault had in 1956 when these films arrived at the studio. So what were they doing here? We have to consider that the state was in control of film production in the country and left this in the control of the labor union and left it up to a group of composers to work with the Churubusco Studios. And as in the case of the US, the building was begun to be built in 1943 at the height of the production, film production in Mexico, and it was built it had labs, 22 studios, and an extraordinary recording studio equipped with the most recent technology. These were the most advanced studios in all of Latin America. In this recording studio, thousands of scores were that were recorded under strict conditions stipulated by the labor unions, and then the film scores were edited, recorded, and once post-production was finished, the production companies would leave all of the magnetic support records and material and leave them behind because they had already done their duplicate copy to be able to edit the film. And the film makers labor union, film producers labor union, so you could only work in the film production if you were a member of this labor union. That's why there was only a handful of people who were able to do this work.
Cuando se encuentra con esta bodega, tiene de alguna manera la visión en la praxis cinematográfica de que el cine va a ser digital, obviamente, hacer una declaratoria, digamos, por tendencia de industria, y el rescate de estas cintas implicaba su migración inmediata a soportes y sistemas numéricos. Aquí es donde comienza en los años 90, a finales de los 90, la construcción de una colección contracorriente. La disidencia, la mitigación justo de la negligencia, del catástrofe de la negligencia a través de la contracorriente civil.
Bueno, entonces me di a la tarea a empezar la labor de rescate. Logré convencer a las autoridades de salvar el acervo digitalizando lo que en aquellos tiempos era muy bueno, el soporte a DAT. Y entonces, bueno, y en 97, pues el uso de Internet no era habitual en las oficinas del gobierno, y no existía más no tenía datos, existía una enciclopedia de cine mexicano y una publicación sobre la historia de los estudios. Y poco a poco tomé conciencia de la importancia del hallazgo. Músicos con carrera académica, componiendo para orquesta, totalmente ignorado por la comunidad cinematográfica. Nadie me puede decir un solo nombre de sus compositores. En ese desastre pude salvar no solamente la música de fondo, pero también unos 2000 playbacks que acompañaban las películas famosas de esos tiempos. Logré digitalizar como 1600 títulos, lo cual corresponde como a 7000 cintas. Y pues yo pienso que a esas alturas lo que se había encontrado es lo que se pudo salvar de todas las políticas sucesivas. Tal vez 60% de los acervos habían ido en humo, como cuando se quemó la Cinemateca en 1982.
Claro. Digamos
y son
que
los
sí,
zapatos de Don Gavira.
Ah, sí, claro. Bueno, esas imágenes que ahorita podemos explicar un poquito al respecto, pero bueno, son imágenes que tomé en los años 90, justo cuando visitaba Civil. Que ella acababa
we had discovered the materials and the importance of these shoes. So they were needed for the analysis of the composition and the music in our country. So the most important collection is the history and the music of Mexican cinema was just as important as it was the second most important to the U.S. collection. So there was a crisis in the music of Mexican cinema because we did not have the original sources for analysis. But this is, then this would be the second object for analysis that would allow the birth of musicology. So this was frankly a very, very important finding. So in 2002, and Sibyl came back, I had written a thesis on music, and I had written some academic papers, and I have become a researcher, as Hugo said at the beginning, and I was very, very connected. And because of those 5 years that I spent with the findings, and when we were sitting there and crying when we found all these materials, it was such a good experience. But when we had to surrender the archive to somebody else, I came back, and I came back to see and hear the same things that we had back in the 1990s from a hard disk and from the tapes. I always kept on hearing the same and the same and the same recording. So there was nothing new, and this was something very strange. So that time, the Minister of Culture called me back, and in 20 years, no tapes or no records had been digitized. They had not even begun with a catalog. They had not checked all the materials. Many of the materials on 35 and 17.5 were lost, and many of the recordings were survived because we had digitized them in Nadat, and Nadat are the master recordings, and they are the only sources that we have. So finally, they gave me a computer and a connection to internet, and after days and days, I was able to start working and building a database. So what we had built was lost, and there were many things that had happened. And then nobody showed a lot of interest in preserving the materials during the time we were not there. And nobody was accountable for that. They just did awful things. Look at this. This is horrible. I mean, you see those machines, those wonderful machines. They sold them. They sold them as if they were junk, and it's a huge problem to work now. It's because the material was so old, we needed those machines to be able to recover and reclaim the material. So in 2017, and so I thought, how are they digitizing if they don't have the structure and the equipment? But the most important thing here is that when we had these questions in mind, you know that the music in streaming and the trading of the soundtracks was already there. It was now common ground. So during my research work, I found these recordings in the hands of producers who would tell me that they had the materials that I had already heard, and the countings, and these could only come from one single archive. Why were they in the hands of the producers? Because there was no way that that music could have been lent to them legally or officially through an agreement with the government, because there were too many gaps in the law regarding proprietorship and copyright. So this could only mean one thing: looting or otherwise, because there was no way that they could have obtained it legally. So this is just to tell you about what we did to mitigate a human disaster and negligence. So it is important that we find a systematic way to prevent these human disasters, and I think that community is at the center, a community that starts with the voice of a dissident artist. So we have been hacking the institutional agenda. So if the institution has an agenda, then well, the agenda, what do you mean agenda? Well, let's assume that there is an agenda. So between 2017 and 2018, Civil constructed her first hack. That means a database that meant having the first comparative database with music for cinema and the composers. And this meant a real breakthrough. Well, I felt so alone. I didn't have, I couldn't, I had a vision of what this archive could be, and I could not share it. And then it was really, really difficult to do it because I didn't have any support from the authorities. So in March 2018, music that has been specially composed for Mexican cinema has been declared UNESCO heritage. So really, this was a way to mitigate disasters. So I was a witness to that, and it meant that it meant that some officers had to get really angry, and it meant that we needed to get the wills for some politicians. I must say that there were some politicians from the Mexican government that decided not to attend the ceremony when the UNESCO heritage declaration was given, because they were very angry. They couldn't understand what we were doing. So I'm working here at the National Sound Archives of Mexico, and I work with young professionals here. But UNESCO sent or issued a notice on the threat for digital archives after 20 years. So the master files that we had digitized are 20 years or older. So I am really, really scared because around only 30% of the heritage has been migrated. So they don't understand, they don't hear us. The masters are in danger right now. So the catastrophe and the threat is for the whole region. But if we don't have training, if we don't know how to preserve, and we are archivists and we don't have good practices and we don't follow good practices, or if producers don't understand about archiving, then it will be really detrimental to our industry, because we won't be able to therefore assess the actual risk of the value of the music in cinema. This is why the collection should be available for everybody, and because there's an urgency for researchers on music. So I built a catalog, and we said there's some music that if it's not properly cataloged, nobody will notice that it is gone. There is an agreement between the Filmoteca and the studies, but that has not, or the studios, but it has not been enforced. Somebody said that the thing is that you have a problem, and we have solved your problems, and so there are they don't understand why we clean, or how do we clean these records. So for me, the problem is that nothing is being done about the preservation of music, because the efforts are to preserve the films and the images. So there is such a sort of a neglect for cinema, and we don't find entities who are interested in using the original tracks of the music that we have. So I have the original material with a sound, with a very fantastic sound quality that I would be able to share with producers. But I had said that this collection is very unique in Latin America, and for me, it is amazing to have this archive. And I think that sometimes people feel frightened because it is so important and it has been so neglected. For me, it means also part of our national identity. You can have a very bad movie with wonderful music. So in closing, I would like to say that the catastrophe in this caused by negligence also was complemented by gender issues. You know, Sybil works basically alone, and in this. And I would like to thank FIAF for giving us room to explain our story, because as you have seen, what we have done was a strategy to preserve a collection for more than 20 years. So we need to support dissidents within our community, because that is the first step for to build a community, and a community without history is nothing. So we hope that this presentation during this symposium be understood as a hack of the institutional agenda. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Jose Maria and Sybil. I think this is one of the most important topics.
This is one of the most important, and I think this really addresses a area that is lacking. We've only recently had high quality scanners to scan optical sound, and as Sybil has said, there are considerable technical limitations to this, and no one really thought about how it was necessary to preserve the recordings from the time of production. So this is a great challenge that you have raised for sound archives, as exists in many countries, including in ours. How do we make sure that magnetic films are kept not only in magnetic form, but also the optical recordings that is joined to the images? Also part of the responsibility, the shared responsibility that a work like this means. Experts in copyright say that cinema is the most complex in terms of copyrights because it combines the largest number of original work, musical interpretation, literary works, architectural work in some cases, obviously visual arts, the filmmakers, the music scores, and all of this making up a single new artistic work. And to the extent that budgets allow, we would need to be able to work in this area. Thank you very much, Jose Maria and Sybil. I very much appreciate you sharing with us from your story and to help us understand how we can change to improve things. The last presentation will be Rolando Diaz, Gerardo Ortiz, and Alfonso Espinosa, who will address the film archives in climate chaos. They are members of the Mexican Film Library and from the Library on Film Restoration. Remember, I will give you a 5-minute and a 2-minute warning, and I will stop you when the time comes. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning to all of you. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for giving us the floor, to the institutions that participate here, the Film Library from UNAM, and the audience that joins us today. We prepared a research work on interviews, and we prepared a video, which I will share with you on the screen now. Our presentation is called Chaos in the Archives in Climate Chaos. Prevention and thoughts on natural disasters. The study presented below is based on the principle that recognizes the impact of any attempt to affect filmed archives. We'll address the case of the National Film Library, Cineteca Nacional Mexico, and the question which guides our study is what to do before, during, and after we face a natural disaster that impacts the work and social or even the community environment and the collections that are being protected. Reflecting on and preventing natural disasters in the film archives of Mexico and in the world requires us to look at this from a scientific standpoint in as much as we can, and to see what the challenge is for us as professionals who work and study with audiovisual documentary collections. Already this is complex, and when we add the disturbing effects of natural phenomena, we often rely on the protocols where we need an approach that is both multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and beyond our disciplines to create a reflection that will address what will happen before, during, and after the event, and to offer some sustained, viable results in the documentary and information sciences, the science of archives, museology, as well as library science, history, philosophy, physics, chemistry, sociology, seismology, the arts, and last but not least, the conservation of the documentary heritage, among others. It is necessary for us to consider elements of these above-mentioned disciplines for the development of conservation strategies that would prevent and that would allow for prevention of a disaster or a chaos, as I've called it. The disciplines mentioned above are at the juncture in filmed archives today. The current interaction of science from a postmodern epistemology is a different model from the deterministic science, and now we've referred to the sciences of complexity, and I cite, this is a genuine effort for creation in which reason and imagination, passion, and rigor as in cinema actively participate, generating a call for a growing number of scientists and artists in various disciplines. The impact of natural and human disasters has marked social transformations throughout the journey and the history of humanity. One of the main objectives of wars and colonial systems was to destroy or to prevent access to the cultural objects of peoples, communities, and nations. The examples are vast. In many cases, there was some effort at preservation, and in many others, there simply wasn't. We need to realize and make clear that as long as we do not access for the appropriation of the documentary heritage of Mexico, the possibilities of having that information or knowledge are lost, and the loss of a national memory and maybe of our own identity is what is at stake. We do not want to make we want to have citizens and national as well as international institutions have access to this. The case of the chaos and climate in the archives in Mexico has historically affected the work of our film archives in our own country due to fires, earthquakes, or floods. And the institutions that safeguard Mexico's film collections have an ethical responsibility and are constantly having to address how they will respond to any type of natural disaster, which is why it's worth sharing how and what preventive measures currently exist. The history of Mexican film heritage in 1982 was seared into our memory with the fire that took over the Cineteca Nacional, an event that is the starting point for the difficulties that can occur in the case of a natural disaster as well. The 1985 or 2017 earthquakes, or the dense floods and rains in the city of Mexico. In the case of the flu or COVID-19 pandemics, are experiences that lead us to want to analyze and reflect upon what we need to do to reduce the impact of the unpredictable changes of nature. The National Film Library was inaugurated on January 17, 1974, and its purpose was to collect, preserve, restore, catalog, conserve, and show all film material, national film material, and that which was produced abroad and which, due to its quality or historical value, had a documentary interest. These same functions were that of the predecessor National Film Library, coordinated from the Education Department by its director, Elena Sanchez Valenzuela, since 1935. In 1976, the General Directorate of Radio, Television, and Cinematography was created, and the National Film Library became part of this. That same year, the Congress of the International Federation of Film Archives, FIAF, had been held at the facilities of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Cineteca had already joined FIAF as an active member since 1977, the year when it began organizing an international film festival, and in 1980 opened for the first time the International Forum of the Cineteca, an opportunity to show documentaries, new creators, as well as avant-garde production. Unfortunately, a fire broke out in 1982 on March 24th.
Ese miércoles 24 de marzo,
Wednesday, March 24, everything seemed like just another spring day at the Cineteca Nacional until a few minutes before 6 p.m. when a film reviewer noticed the smell of smoke. And it wasn't until he checked vault number 1 that he saw white smoke and called his coordinator on duty to call the fire department. The support from the fire department came slowly, and they tried to identify, and there was a 6 p.m. planned projection of La Tierra Prometida by Andrés Vazda, The Land of Great Promise, to be projected in the Fernando de Fuentes Hall. The fire could not be stopped, and it lasted 16 hours. It destroyed the facilities as well as a great part of documents of historical value. More than 5,000 films, books, magazines, a register of catalogs, original scripts, photographs, among other documents that would never be able to be consulted again. On the 30th of March, a committee for the recovery of the National Film Archive was established. The authorities on duty said that they had been warned about this before.
el reporte oficial, 3 muertos, varios
The
heridos.
official report noted that 3 people had been killed or died, several had been wounded, and the document is now part of the General Archive of the nation, as well as in the FIAF Huaxtepec Congress of 1982, where the director was also interviewed, assigning details to the expert's report. On September 23, 1982, the Patronato for the Reconstruction and Recovery of the National Library was founded. Gabriel Figueroa was the vice director, and only ashes remained, and the place was cleaned as a result. Producers facilitated copying their own films, and throughout that year, the film program continued in theaters outside of the Cinematheca. The natural disaster is still news 38 years later, a historical mark for the country and the world's film culture, and another lesson for Mexico particularly, and for humanity more broadly. There are relevant investigations that have been carried out on this topic. However, it will always be a question, and the determination is that under no circumstances should this ever happen again in Mexico, which relives its memory with the burning of the codices and the Amoxcalis during the Spanish context. At that time, Mexico's conservation and restoration groups, librarians, and archivists were only beginning to study the issue of paper conservation, and many had not finished their studies because of the demand for work. There were very few specialists, and most people had to go abroad to get training. On January 27, 1984, in the cultural space known as the Coyoacán, in the town of Jocó, in south of the city, where you could still breathe the smog from the downtown area, new installations were built for the Cineteca Nacional. This reconstruction was under the work of architect Manuel Rocha, and by 1985, the 4 theaters with room for 550 spectators were prepared. On the morning of September 19, 1985, an earthquake of magnitude 8.1 on the Richter scale, with an epicenter on the Pacific coast off the coast of Michoacán, affected Mexico City. People who inhabited in the southern zone of the city said that they were able to carry out on their daily activities, and they were able to witness the catastrophe and the chaos. The road traffic that was stopped, and many remained trapped in buildings. There were no phone lines in much of the city, and the landscape was just desolate. the earth was heard, and there was a strange abyss in terms of the government response toward towards the Mexican society. By that time, Cineteca Nacional had been closed. There were no structural damages to these recently built facilities and to the small but growing acquisition of bibliographic, documentary, and film material. The Mexican media directed what were the immediate needs, and it was the most important coverage in the history of Mexican media. The search and rescue period lasted approximately for 1 month and was supported by 45 other countries. And the official figures say that approximately 10,000 people lost their lives and countless numbers were never heard from again. In spite of this earthquake, it was evident that the origin of the epicenter de Chocó, where the Cineteca Nacional, were not connected. Nonetheless, this impacted the conscience of all Mexicans and revived our own memory. In the face of this catastrophe, this was a way to face, in an interview in 1940, the archaeologist Eduardo Montes Moctezuma said, and I quote, "At this moment, the film and photographic activity began, as well as social memory, which would give rise to remind us of the need to be prepared, because we are living in a seismic zone, and that's the nature of our geography." In 1994, 4 vaults were built, 1 for black and white films and 3 for color, all of them with climate control and safety measures, climate, humidity, and temperature following the FIAF standards. Another decision made at the time was that nitrate would be kept at the UNAM vaults, far away from the educational facilities and near a fire station. In 1996, the Cineteca Nacional was integrated to the National Council for Culture and the Arts as part of the Ministry of Education. By 2012, the Cineteca Nacional 21st Century, as it was called, was reopened by architects Michel Rojín, Mauricio Rocha, and Gabriela Carrillo, and included a lab for digital restoration. And this began internal digitalization programs and collaborations with other international as well as national institutions, as well as outreach for the public with the Archive of Memory program. A video library was opened with centralized place for public consultations, as well as spaces to view films, a new space with mobile shelves, and 4 new projection rooms were built, 1 outdoor, a film museum, and the administration facilities were expanded, and better equipment was acquired. In 2014, the academic extension program was begun with the University of Guadalajara, and in 2015, this became part of the newly created Secretariat of Culture. On September 19, 2017, there were ceremonies, exhibitions, film screenings, and discussion tables, and there was a simulation in commemoration of the 32nd anniversary of the 1985 earthquake, now called S19, were prepared and held in the area of the Valley of Mexico. Thus, at Cineteca Nacional, the role of civil protection training were carried out. The fire brigades participated, and many people remembered what happened at that team. Several days later, a couple of hours after this drill at 1:14, there was another earthquake of magnitude 7.1 with the epicenter in the state of Morelos, only 120 kilometers to the south of Mexico City. Seismic alarms in a large part of Mexico City were not activated, nor at the Cineteca Nacional, as there were no earthquake detector systems in the area of the epicenter. So many members of the team had no time to leave their work areas. Those who were near the meeting points were the only ones who were able to witness the earthquake from outside the center. Other colleagues reported that they were in the nitrate vault, where there was a possibility of easily evacuating the facilities and finding a safe place. This earthquake lasted in the most intense phase, 36 seconds to 1 minute in the southern areas of the city. Once the earthquake ended, everyone arrived at the meeting point, some with nervous breakdowns that exceeded the capacity of response by the civil protection units at the time. No deaths were recorded on our premises, and the projection rooms had not yet been placed in service. By 2017, the landscape was already different. The memory in our society of the 1985 earthquake and the constant earthquakes in Mexico City are present, and studies of engineering and urban development, sociology, and even information sciences contribute to giving us conceptual and practical tools as to how to address the disasters of earthquakes. In spite of this, the authorities of the Mexican city government insist on not being conscientious in remembering this, in the use of land that is authorized and a lack of strict rules for construction companies, because in spite of the fact that legislation exists, the reality of man's ego means that they do not consider the effect or the consequences of their act, nor the value of natural resources, nor of human life. The 2017 earthquake left 360 dead, 3,289 wounded, and a great deal of damage in the southern and central states of areas of the country. In this event, the media and internet helped, but they also undermined the basic and fundamental right to information to address the many dimensions of the natural disaster that took place. In this context, the training of different protection brigades of civil protection in each area of the Cinemateca Nacional were reinforced, and the report was that there were minimum damages. Measures were taken up to be able to back up information. Problems in the infrastructure, complex problems were resolved. And afterwards, we worked to promote audiovisual collections that address the issues of human and as well as natural disasters. On the other hand, rains in Mexico City are also unpredictable and throughout modern history have generated disasters with very different situations. The case of Cinemateca Nacional is no exception to this. In 2014, the god Tlaloc reminded us this with a hailstorm that flooded the main dome, generating a water filtration that affected both theaters 7 and 9 on the first floor. These were problems that were solved in a couple of days. Even though these mishaps caused by the storms have been addressed, there is a constant need for evaluation related to the maintenance of our roof areas, as well as cleaning the ducts for the water discharges and the drainage system to which we are linked. The geographical area in the village of Soco, which is an area of homes and buildings that are no more than 6 stories tall, has now disappeared. More than 20-floor buildings with prices that are completely inaccessible to most Mexicans represent the panorama of a postmodern information knowledge or intelligent cities that does not consider necessarily the risk of climate chaos and give us a panorama of the chaos that can emerge in a vulnerable and a risk-prone situation, both for natural as well as human disasters. Our national Cineteca cannot exist in a detached way from the urban and collective social environment where we are located, or how this will affect our substantive functions. Renovations will not only result out of chaos and disaster, but out of a constant monitoring of the needs, as well as the conscientious work of our own staff, as well as of the film community more broadly. Due to financial shortages and the lack of clear policies on film heritage in our national culture, investments have been made in maintenance and conservation areas, as well as encouraging constant training for our staff. Currently, in Mexico, there are programs of institutions to address any sort of risk situations, such as the System for National Civil Protection, the National Center for Disaster Prevention, the Center for Registry of Earthquakes and Seismic Instrumentation, the National Seismological Service, the National Meteorological Service, and the participation of CONAGUA, in its general coordination of the National Meteorological Service. In terms of international coordination, there are recommendations for natural disaster plans and protocols from FIAF, the International Federation of Film Archives, as well as from the International Council on Archives, ICA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, and the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, among others. Each has protocols for monitoring phenomena that can affect national and international situations. The Cineteca Nacional has taken on these protocols and prepared protection plans against chaos like this and the prevention of natural and human disasters due to its own needs as an institution that preserves, conserves, organizes, and disseminates film and documentary archives. The creation of the Digital Restoration Lab of Cineteca Nacional always intended to work with film matters on nitrate, acetate, polyester, regardless of its state of degradation. That is why security, climate controls, and addressing any disturbing agents were a priority. Climate adversities are a constant threat for the conservation of film material, and so temperature and humidity are the main considerations. It goes without saying that water and high temperatures have a disastrous effect on film material, which in many cases can be uncontrollable and have catastrophic consequences. Before preparing and having specific plans to face natural disasters that we are exposed to, every archive and lab must have general safety regulations, which are the basis for the prevention of disasters, whether they be natural or human. These safety regulations must address essential points such as who will be in charge of monitoring safety, mapping the facilities, sources, knowing what the sources of water, gas, electricity are. They should also indicate how to store chemical reagents and to label them correctly. These manuals, as well as safety protocols, even though they are based on official standards and reference protocols, must be personalized for each location and space and consider the specific needs of the location, as there are no identical manuals between labs or collections of any institution. The Digital Restoration Lab of the Cineteca Nacional has its own security regulations, which are constantly being revised and modified. Earthquakes are one of the disasters we most frequently face in Mexico City and are the perfect precursor to both fires as well as water leaks. The Cineteca Nacional has a general plan for evacuating our facilities that includes a central axis for civil protection brigades specialized in search and rescue and other operations, firefighting and first aid. And these brigades are made up of teams of volunteer staff from the different departments in the Cineteca Nacional who receive specialized training several times a year. Our digital restoration laboratory has a protocol for evacuation drills and take into account the cases of earthquakes, floods, and fires. This document states that more than one incident or disaster can be caused by the same natural phenomenon and proposes a wholesale evacuation where all three types of disasters already mentioned will occur simultaneously, and how to act in each case of disaster, whether they occur separately or together. The protocol covers the measures that must be taken depending on the incident and the steps that must be followed, from the alarm that should be sounded in the case of the incident, creating internal brigades, where the responsibility, who will have responsibility for disconnecting services, opening doors, calling the authorities, among others activities. There's also a questionnaire to evaluate the efficiency of the drills, where the response time, participants, circumstances of the drill, among other factors, are measured. And finally, the new and most recent protocol to be able to return to work in the face of the pandemic caused by COVID-19 applies to Cineteca Nacional generally, and specifically to each department or area within our institution. This is a document that addresses safety measures, health measures, the entrance filters to the facility, the equipment that we will be working with, and the frequency with which it will be used. What some chemical solutions need to be used for disinfecting, and questionnaires that will be used with our own staff to monitor symptoms, what techniques will be used to disinfect rooms, As always, the reference documents will be protocols from other institutions, official recommendations, as well as our own research and contribution. Even though all these security protocols exist within our Cineteca Nacional, the direction, and particularly that of the Digital Restoration Laboratory, are documents that consider the security and safety of employees as well as the users of our facilities. The safety of film material in the archives and restored in the laboratory is not disregarded either. The security is based on a structural theme which takes into account preventive conservation. Basic issues such as waterproofing the building, controlling humidity and temperature, smoke detectors, and a constant film review frame by frame, monitoring of our vaults, constant cataloging. Particular care is attention to the Digital Restoration Laboratory due to the conditions and characteristics of the film material that we work with there, where we have special storage cabinets to store material that are in advanced stages of degradation, especially when this involves cellulose nitrate. This cabinet is a concrete chamber covered in steel to avoid fire reaching this in case the material becomes self-igniting. We also have an environmental vapor analyzer to measure acid gases generated by the film in order to not exceed the safe values. The main tool that we use against any disaster within the archives and the laboratory will always be prevention, where the annual plan in our area and in the laboratory will always be and is essential to work on cataloging, documenting, and digitalizing. And above all, in case of any natural catastrophe or disaster, we need to be as orderly and straightforward as possible in recovering and searching for our cultural heritage. We've also drafted manuals and theoretical protocols as to how to react in cases of disasters. It's important for us to make this information more broadly known, which we can attain this frequent trainings in the areas of civil protection and preservation. In regards to the care for our own collection faced with a natural disaster,
prevention is everything, means everything when we are facing natural disaster. And this is where the different disciplines come together to create more possibilities for conservation, preservation, dissemination, and organizations in the face of unexpected scenarios for our film collections. So we can be part of the world, and this is where we bring together all the resources to elevate the human spirit. It is possible to safeguard all of our collections and all of our heritage. We need to be non-inertial with respect to this work. We need to bring back to life those contents that are part of our history. And the better we control and organize our collections, the easier we will be able to face climatic cause. So thank you to all the people who have worked in cultural institutions, and we especially remember those who lost their life during natural disasters and during the pandemic. Your teachings will always remain among us. Well, thank you, Alfonso. Thank you, Gerardo. Thank you, Rolando. We had a problem with time. See that now we will move on to the Q&A session. There are a few comments here. I am going to upload a link so that you can all copy it and use it. Jorge Vera has sent a link for a free publication in the internet regarding how to teach the importance of preservation and conservation of films, and particularly photography. Pamela said that she completely agrees with what has been presented by Marilina Franco, and she asks, and this is something very important for our archives, are there any experiences or training centers that are not or that do not lie within the archives that are training on these abilities. I don't know, Marilia, if you can answer this. Do you know about any training center that is not necessarily an archival institution who are training on preservation and conservation from the beginning of a movie, of the life cycle of a film? So
la Escuela de Cine de Universidad
the
Federal de Rio
film school of Rio de Janeiro has training course on preservation and conservation. In fact, they have created a laboratory on conservation. I think that Joao will be able to speak better about that. I am not sure, completely sure, but I think that that is the only institution in Brazil that has a specific training on preservation. And that is a problem because I don't propose that film schools have training on preservation as a specialty, but rather to speak to students about preservation from the beginning, starting from the preservation of the information, not the film, not the sound, or not the software, or not whatever. But they have rather to understand that all the information that they can conserve and preserve regarding their production will be fundamental for somebody who comes to preserve the film or the video. Basically, in this digital world, then what is the foundation or the origin of the movie? Because otherwise it would be impossible to preserve it. So producers from the beginning, when they are in film school or when they are starting to record anything or video or in any other means, they need to know that any information regarding the production will be critical when the time to make the preservation work on his work will come. So Lisbeth Torres Acosta is asking, the digitization work as the one that Sibyl did does not finish there. So how can we make the community understand that preservation is or that digitization is only a part of preservation? But I don't know if you would like to respond to this question, Sibyl. In fact, we need to understand that the audio or the sound in films is not always regarded as important. We think, what do we do now with this collection? So if the collection is not available or is not disseminated, then nobody knows about it. Film schools don't care about it. There is no policy and there is no awareness about safeguarding the recovery of the soundtracks and the problem this means. I think that we are link in the chain. We need it is for the film restoration, for the movies, and there are some wonderful compositions, but I cannot work by myself. Paolo Tosini is asking, how could they help you from outside Mexico to preserve this collection? This is a wonderful question. Thank you, Paolo. I would like to quickly tell you about an experience of how somebody helped us from outside. It is about hacking the institutional agenda. Some 20 years ago, a journalist from France interviewed Sibyl about the collection. We had other problems back then. It was a problem with the original magnetic tapes. So they published 2 articles in Libération in France, And that brought was brought to the attention of the Mexican government, and then many players involved really looked at us. So as Hugo said a few moments ago, it is important to tell the story so that we can actually give shape to the problem and show it as such. In the panelist chat, they were saying about the funding that institutions can receive, but it is not only a matter of money and funds. If we don't have proper training, and if production houses don't know that archiving is critical in the process, then we can't do much more, even if we have the money. So we have to look at the problem, make it visible, but also we need to understand it from the inside. We need to bring the case of the sound of Mexican movies as a case study. We need to talk to the composers and the importance of symphonic music. If we have no researchers, there is no single book in Mexico about music for cinema. There is nothing, completely nothing about that. And I have no money to pay a researcher. We can't do nothing about that. Despite the fact that a good part of Mexican cinema, as it is understood outside the world in 1935 to 1955, depends on the same dramatic structure of music halls, which was not called music hall in Mexico. It had another name, but it was like music, love scene music, fight music, love scene music, everybody happy. So that is the power of music. The power of music is huge in Mexican films, and we have Kubirat Ayula, sorry if we mispronounced your name, but he is in Nigeria, and asking Marelia Franco, speaking about the culture of preservation for filmmakers, for the producers, and he's not clear about the preservation chain that could be offered. Could we speak about that, Marilia? How could one establish a preservation chain that starts with the filmmaker and ends in the archive? This is exactly the chain that I want to build, at least theoretically, in order to shed some light in this very complicated path. People in the film industry have to understand that preservation begins in production. So, in fact, the chain begins with quality information about a production. So, basically, and this is basic for digital preservation. So, what was the software used? What archetypes were used? How was it videoed? So, in universities, how would they search for the information? Let's say if we are finding versions of the script, how they did begin, and what was the last version of the script. And this is very important when we find a movie that is broken into pieces, or when it has parts that you cannot see any longer. It is very important to have the script, because that could be the guide to be able to put the film together. That is a problem of the curator, right? But the curator has to have the possibility to find that information somewhere. So At this time, as we speak, we're working with the Federal University of Paraíba to create a Cinematheque, and we are starting to build a data bank for production in Paraíba. They have a nice film festival at the end of the year, and they are good. They are a good setting for live action films, and we are including that information in that Cinematheque because we want that information to be available if it is needed. It's like a little black box that we know contains film. And it would be wonderful if we could always have the information for that film, because otherwise it'll just remain a little film in a box. It would be some as the cataloging labels that we put on the tins. Now we have to put it on the CDs or on the small memory cards that we save our material in right now. I always tell my producer friends that even if the film was made only digital, they should try to have a negative, because we want Cinematheques to have collections of moving images, and because this is very useful. But we need to have the equipment, as Sibylla and Jose Maria said. We need to have Western electrics in order to be able the sound of the movies of the 40s and the 50s, and we need to have an operator. We need also to have sound mixing units, and we need to have image mixing units with whole formats and with capacities for UCB, USB-C, USB-7, USB 3, Lightning, and all these cables that are connecting to our hard disks. Francisco Veda Acevedo Gutierrez is asking if the Filmoteca or Cinemateca have any specialized courses on archiving. We don't yet, but we will start bringing it to our curriculum. We are thinking of having some certified courses, so we are thinking about bringing sound curators and image curators from other collections to teach those courses. And I don't know if the Cineteca will be doing that. We are planning to do it in the film at Filmoteca. We are very intense regarding our collections, but I don't know if Gerardo can help us with that. And can I say something? Right now, we have some sort of fellowships, or we have some tailor-made courses, but we can work. But they are designed upon a request, and we do it with a specific collection. But I would like to say something. Our preservation culture must not forget production. I have worked with several production houses, and they have the vision of the impact of their films and the historical value of the films. And some don't have it. So we need to build this culture. We need to build a culture of information, and also safeguarding the information that are the framework of the film. We need to raise awareness about the importance, and we have also to be aware of our individual roles in preservation. But we also have to know how much we can do as individuals and how much should be left to curators. So it is, but producing means curating, and curating means producing. So I think that is something very important. I have Juana Suarez around, and this is a shared concern for all of us who are in this event right now. What can we do about the Brazilian Cinematheque? I mean, we know some evident responses, but I would love to know what can we do to support you and to help you. What is the support that you need to preserve the Cinemateca and to keep it as a historic preservation institution, which belongs first and foremost to the people of Brazil, but also for Latin Americans and the world?
Hugo, can I speak?
Eu estou sem imagem aqui.
I don't have the video, but
Start my video aqui. Okay.
I stopped my video, but I can talk. Here I am. Thank you.
Estamos assim, creio que em momento muito
I think
importante.
we're at an important time today. We are not able to take to the streets because of COVID, and we are powerless while witnessing, for example, the destruction of the rainforest, fires not only in the Amazon, but also in the Pantanal, in the southern region, and very probably, if nothing changes, we will also be witnessing the destruction or the disappearance of our national identity, which is at risk with our current government. In the same way that I think there is an international movement economically in terms of Brazilian products, I think we have to also, from the community of archives and libraries, film libraries that are represented here, I think we have to talk about international pressure. We need letters. We have had hundreds of letters and very important expressions of solidarity from President Dupont of the FIAF, who wrote a very important article in Sight and Sound. But I think more is needed. We have to do perhaps efforts at UNESCO, at pressure through UNESCO on the World Day of Audiovisual Preservation, to do something so that UNESCO will bring pressure to bear on the Ministry of Foreign Relations, so that there be an answer to what is happening with all of these decisions that have been put off and delayed, that where things have been promised but nothing has been done. That's just one idea. But among all of us, I think we are we feel very powerless today. May I? Marilia has also raised her hand, and then Solange, you can have the floor also. And then we'll move on to a number of other questions. 2 points that I wanted to mention. First, regarding an important issue, how do we work on preservation from the beginning of production? We've seen an example from the Research Center on Brazilian film in congresses during the 90s, at the beginning of the 90s. We proposed that in the budgets of films, a copy for preservation and the cost of making a copy for preservation be included. This was done where a line item in the budget would already be included to make a copy that would go to the film library to ensure that this film be preserved for posterity. That was done years ago. I think it's possible to propose that there be a small amount to have the support of a documentarian during the production. There are people who are professionals in this area who can orient filmmakers. There are companies even who can do this.
Los documentos de
How
producción,
to keep versions of the script, technical information on the production, especially now that they are all digital. All of that needs to be budgeted as well, because that costs money. And the filmmaker is busy doing something else, not this specifically. So others need to be called on to carry out this service so that productions would have a small file with all of this information that can later be filed away in the film library. But the issue is to budget for this as of the beginning, and I think we need to think as to how we create a culture of film preservation. I think that's one part. The other, how to pressure the Brazilian government. I think UNESCO and FIAF and film libraries from throughout the world could call on to create an international campaign to write the Brazilian government, to write to the Secretary of Culture. It's a minister, but now it's been reorganized as a secretariat, so that that government official would receive questions, emails, and questions that would be asked once and then asked again every couple of months, so that they would be aware. I don't know if this will have any result, because these are very insensitive professionals and they are not interested in culture, because culture is memory. But I think we need to pressure these government officials so that they would take into account the preservation of our cultural memory.
Específica que tenemos por ahí,
Solange,
Civil.
Solange, and then I have a question for Sybil. I just wanted to add to what has already been said by João Luis and Marilia about the need for international action. This is a destruction of memory, a destruction of our history. The UNESCO Memory of the World Brazil program is linked to the work of the Ministry of Culture. And at the beginning of this government administration, all of these programs, there was no plan necessarily to cancel work of this committee, but anything having to do with social issues or gender issues was disregarded. And that has never been reorganized with the committee, and the committee isn't able to do anything. We didn't even have a call for projects for the Memory of the World, the MOW program. And I repeat just what you've already heard from João Luis and from Marilia, that we need international pressure to be brought on the Brazilian government, because as Marilia has already said, these are people who are not interested at all in the preservation of national culture, of our national culture. Without pressure, nothing will change.
Solange, al principio,
Question for Solange. You mentioned a Brazilian research center at the outset that would protect documentary sources. Would you? There's a question from one of our attendees. There are two major research centers: the Brazilian Film Studies and the Brazilian Society for Audiovisual Preservation. I can include the addresses, the internet addresses of both of those centers. Thank you.
Tania Ruiz,
We have a question from Tania
por ahí que la
Ruiz.
Civil José María.
Perhaps it would be worth contacting her directly. Is there the possibility of having academic links with you, Sybil, to work on the archive? I'm thinking about academic exchanges or programs that would allow interns to work. I'm not able to see myself on the screen, but when I had my studio, I had machines and the material. Now at the Fonoteca, there's a floor with a cataloger. I'm at another place and I no longer have access or control over my archive. I'd like to help this questioner, but she would have to propose something like an academic course, and I'll be able to help with that.
Complementando esto,
Viendo una liga para que la revises.
I'm putting a link in the chat, and you can write that link, and we can bring the question. It may not be possible, but write us, and we'll see if there's a possibility of cooperation or collaboration with the Sound Archive. From Desiree Pivot Nolan, is there an English version of the ebook Audiovisual Preservation in the Age of Pixels? And if so, could you share it in the chat? If you have a copy, we'll leave the session open for some 10 minutes more until 11 a.m. Mexico City time, until the top of the hour for everyone else. I thank all of you for having joined us. Marilia, Solange, João, Sybil, Jose Maria, Rolando, Gerardo, and Alfonso. I think this was a very enriching conversation that we were able to have on film archives, and I think we'll continue to share knowledge and our experiences. Thank you very much. Take care, and we will continue tomorrow sharing information on our film libraries. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Many thanks. Bueno, querida,